Hello everyone, a hearty welcome to the video lecture series offered by the Postgraduate Department of English, Payyanur College, Payyanur. This video lecture is based on the lesson The Banking Concept of Education written by Paulo Freire, which is included as the fourth chapter of the textbook Demystifying Knowledge, Readings on Philosophy of Knowledge, prescribed for the fourth semester UG English Common Course students of Kannur University as course 4A06 ENG. First of all, let's have a brief introduction about the author. Paulo Freire was a Brazilian educator, teacher, writer, and philosopher. He experienced poverty and hunger at a young age as a result of the Great Depression, and it severely affected his education. Such experiences influenced his decision to dedicate his life for inspiring lives of the poor and helped him to understand the relation between socio-economic conditions and education. So, when his financial situations improved, he worked in poverty-stricken areas of Brazil in his early career and helped the illiterate adults to control their own lives. Thus, it enabled him to formulate theoretical attitudes to education, which was later called critical pedagogy. His most influential work is Pedagogy of the Oppressed, which is published in 1970, and it is considered as one of the foundational texts of critical pedagogy. Before learning the chapter, we should know what is meant by pedagogy and critical pedagogy. We can simply define pedagogy as the study of the method of teaching. It is the approach to teaching as an academic subject. That means it is the theoretical conception of the teaching methods. At the same time, it also deals with the social, political, and psychological development of the learners. Then, the next term is critical pedagogy. What is meant by critical pedagogy? Critical pedagogy is a teaching approach or method which helps the students to gain critical consciousness. It assists the students to become critically conscious, to question domination and challenge the practices and actions that dominate them. That means critical pedagogy helps the students to liberate from any kind of oppression. This book, that is The Pedagogy of the Oppressed, is meant and dedicated to the oppressed. And the prescribed chapter, that is The Banking Concept of Education, is the second chapter of this book. In the first chapter of this book, Paulo Freire already built an antagonistic relation between the oppressor and the oppressed, where the oppressed need to be liberated out of their unfair social order created by the oppressed. In this first chapter, he introduces two processes. They are humanization and dehumanization, which are the central problems of humankind. These are the major problems faced by the human beings. And both these processes, that is humanization and dehumanization, are the products of historical oppression. These are the products of historical oppression. Two classes are formed out of it. That means two classes are formed out of oppression. They are the oppressed and the oppressor. The oppressed are always trying to liberate themselves from the oppression by regaining humanity, whereas the oppressor dehumanize and oppress the poor using power. So, instead of taking the place of the oppressor, the oppressed should liberate themselves. The process of humanization is not merely for ourselves, but also to humanize the oppressors. That means the result of the liberation is dialectical in nature. Dialectical means conflict between two separate ideas that are synthesized into a new idea. So here, in this situation of oppression, a subjective change should be brought along with an objective change. In short, his argument is that the oppressed people had to liberate their oppressors while liberating themselves. People should see the world in a different perception, and the society should change along with that change. These changes occur only through praxis. Praxis means idea should be transformed into an action. And it can be done with the help of educational projects. A pedagogy led by the oppressor cannot help the oppressed people, because, as you know, it is the product or result of oppressive system, and there is no democracy and equality. You can see the same ideology in the traditional Western education. In a nutshell, Paulo Freire is actually analyzing the hidden agendas of the colonial project, and he is bringing a post-colonial perspective in the field of education. Now, let's begin the chapter. In the chapter, The Banking Concept of Education, Paulo Freire is bringing the oppressor-oppressed relation in the field of education. That means he is bringing the oppressor-oppressed relation, which is mentioned in the first chapter, into a micro level, that is in the field of education. According to him, the teacher-student relationship at any level is fundamentally narrative in nature. As you know, narration is a method of conveying a story or information to an audience by a narrator, and the narrator is active in this process, whereas the listener is a passive recipient. Here, the teacher-student relationship inside or outside the school involves a narrating subject, that is the teacher, and a listening object, that is the students. The process is seen as a commentary or story constructed and told exclusively by the teacher without the students having any choice anywhere. So, the teacher becomes an authority, whereas the students are reduced to passive receptacles. In such a process of narration, the contents become lifeless and petrified. That means hard and uninspiring. That is why he said that education is suffering from narration sickness, because narrative education without democratic dialogue between the teacher and the student is an unhealthy practice. The teacher's undemocratic control over the way of presentation and content make the process of education naive as well as dead. And the topic dealt in this way is completely alien to the existential experience of the students. That means contents outside the experience of the students like caste, gender, etc. will become strange and foreign to them. The task of the teacher is to fill the students with the contents of his narration, whereas the contents are detached from reality. Though verbosity, which means excessive and unnecessary use of words, is a feature of this method, the words used by the teacher are empty or hollow and alien to the students. The words lack concreteness and its inner feeling is lost. Another outstanding characteristic of this narrative education is the sonority of words. What is meant by sonority? Sonority means resonance or the vibrancy of the sound. And this resonance is part of the teacher's voice, not of the student's voice. Because in the banking concept of education, it is narrative in nature, and at the same time, the teacher is authoritative. The student records, memorizes, and repeats the phrases and words without perceiving the original concept which is taught. Some examples are given in your textbook. That is, 4 times 4 is 16. Or the capital of para is Belém. In these occasions, the students are made to by heart without understanding its significance or the relation between the two. Narration leads the students to memorize the content mechanically. Learning becomes a mechanical process. That is, the emphasis is on rote memory. Students are by-hearting the content. So, narrative method turns the students into mere containers or receptacles to be filled by the teacher. Students are like a piggy bank in which the teachers are depositing knowledge. That is the disadvantage of this banking concept of education. Here, education become an act of depositing in which the students are depositories and the teacher is the depositor. This is the banking concept of education, in which the scope of action allowed to the student is only receiving, filling and storing the deposits. It limits the scope of the student's action. Lack of creativity, transformation and knowledge is another feature of this misguided system. We know that real knowledge emerges through invention, reinvention, then impatience, restless inquiry, etc. But in the banking concept of education, knowledge is a gift bestowed or given by the so-called knowledgeable, and they consider the students as ignorant. Treating others as ignorant is a characteristic of the ideology of the oppression. The teacher present themselves as their necessary opposite by treating the students as absolutely ignorant. That means a binary is introduced in this system, that is teacher versus students. And here the students accept their ignorance for justifying the teacher's existence, and they never discover that they also educate the teacher. Here, Paulo Freire offers the problem-posing method of education or libertarian education in opposition to the banking concept of education. Now, what is the purpose of libertarian education? The purpose of libertarian education lies in its drive towards reconciliation. That means the teacher and the student should be treated equally, and there should be a cordial relationship between the teacher and the student. Education must begin with the solution of the teacher-student contradiction which is present in the banking system. A mutual or reciprocal relation between the teacher and the student should be established so that both are simultaneously teachers and students. Such a contradiction between the teacher and the student is maintained in the banking concept by certain practices and attitudes which reflect the oppressive society. That is, an oppressor-oppressed relation is found in this banking education system. Which are those practices? Let me read it out from your textbook. First one, the teacher teaches and the students are taught. The teacher is the whole authority of great knowledge and the students are passive recipients. Second one, the teacher knows everything and the students know nothing. The students are reduced to ignorant people. Third one, The teacher thinks and the students are thought about. The teacher is the one with critical or thinking capacity. Fourth one, the teacher talks and the students listen meekly. There is no voice for the students. Next one, the teacher disciplines and the students are disciplined. It is a way of controlling or suppressing the students. Next one, the teacher chooses and enforces his choice and the students complain. Next one, the teacher acts and the students have the illusion of acting through the action of the teacher. Next one, the teacher chooses the program content and the students who are not consulted adapt to it. It is a way of controlling the students. The teacher confuses the authority of knowledge with his or her own professional authority, which she and he sets in opposition to the freedom of the students. And the last one, the teacher is the subject of the learning process while the pupils are mere objects. Human beings are reduced to mere objects in this banking concept of education. From these, it is understood as the banking concept regards men as adaptable and manageable beings. They are capable of adapting to any kind of situation and they are being controlled. So when the students accept the passive role imposed on them, they simply adapt to such an unfair system. They simply adapt the world as it is and they don't realize the fact that it is a fragmented view of reality deposited in them. They are passive containers and they lack critical consciousness, which is gained by involving and intervening in the social affairs of the world and as transformers of the world. This practice minimizes creativity and acts as a barrier to critical and creative faculties. This feature also serves the interest of the oppressors who don't even want to see a transformed world. The oppressors use their humanitarianism to preserve a profitable situation. That means the humanitarian approaches shown by the oppressors are for gaining profit. Let us take the example of colonization of India by the Europeans. The Europeans provided English language education to Indians as part of their colonial project. It is not completely a humanitarian act. It is actually a false generosity to gain profit of some kind. So, here these oppressors react against any experiments in the field of education which stimulate the critical faculties of the oppressed. And the interest of the oppressor also lies in changing the consciousness of the oppressed and not the situations which oppress them. To achieve this, the oppressor used the banking concept of education along with a paternalistic social action. That means they are applying this method like the authority or superiority of a father figure in a family. And the oppressed here receive a euphemistic title of welfare recipients. What is meant by euphemism? Euphemism is the use of a mild word instead of harsh and offensive one. Here, the term welfare recipients is the mild term used instead of the oppressed, who are treated as deviants or marginal persons in the so-called good, organized and just society. So here our author is using this term in an ironic way. The oppressed are regarded as diseased people of a healthy society, which is actually referring to the unfair social order without democratic values. So these marginals need to be included in the healthy society which abandoned them. In short, the conditions of exploitation continues by making the oppressed to accept the conditions of exploitation through this banking mode of education. In this system, the educated individuals are adapted people and are fit for this world. But this concept is apt to the oppressor-oppressed unfair system because the oppressed people fit the world created by the oppressor and they can't raise a question against it. The oppressed are just adapting to the situations created by the oppressor. That is, the majority adapt to the purposes prescribed for them by the minority and later the minority can prescribe. The role of the bank clerk educator. The bank clerk educator is the educator in the banking system of education. So the role of this bank clerk education as a source of great knowledge is an insecure one, and that is why the educators fears to communicate with the students or refuses to have a discussion or debate. The educators in this system are insecure, and because of this they fear to communicate with the students. Also, banking education cannot promote biophily but produces necrophily. What is meant by biophily and necrophily? Biophilia and necrophilia are two concepts advanced by Erich Fromm. And biophilia refers to the affinity of human beings to other forms of life, growth, change, and even to future. Whereas necrophilia is the affinity shown towards dead, static, permanent, and fixed world. So, according to Paulo Freire, the banking mode of education has a tendency to promote necrophilia because It has a false understanding of the people as objects, and it serves the interest of the oppression. But the oppressed who choose liberation are influenced by the aspects of the banking concept. So it fails to realize its dehumanizing power. Hence, we should abandon the goals of deposit making and replace it with problem posing one. So coming to the problem posing method of education, in this method, dialogue is the method chosen for education. In the case of banking concept of education, we learned that narration is the method chosen, but in the case of problem posing education, dialogue is the method chosen for education. Hence, the teacher in this system is not only the one who teaches, but also the one who taught himself or herself in dialogue with the student. The teacher becomes the one who teaches, and at the same time, he or she becomes the student as well. They become jointly responsible for the process of learning in which all grow together. And authority is replaced by freedom in this problem posing method. Authority is a feature of the banking concept of education, whereas freedom is the method or what is gained from the problem posing education. In the words of Paulo Freire, no one teaches another and nor is anyone self-taught. No one teaches another and nor is anyone self-taught. That means people teach each other mediated by the world in this mode of learning. The people are aware of their incompletion in the problem posing education. Education is a process in which the educator as well as the students are unfinished and incomplete beings. And this unfinished character of human beings and the transformational nature of reality demands us to believe that education is an ongoing activity. This is the advantage of the problem posing method of education. Compared to the conservative banking method, which emphasizes permanence, problem solving method is dynamic in nature and it is also revolutionary. In the case of banking concept of education, it is actually a conservative one and it gives importance to permanence. Whereas in the case of problem posing method, it is actually dynamic and revolutionary in nature. The banking method directly or indirectly reinforces men's fatalistic perception of their situation. That means they are having a submissive attitude that all events are predetermined and inevitable and they are powerless to change them. They accept the oppression as their fate. They believe in fate. But the problem posing method presents situation as a problem. Hence, such situations become the object of their cognition. That means they become critically and intellectually conscious about their reality, which gives way to new perceptions. The problem-posing method of education enables the teachers and the students to become subjects of the educational process by overcoming authoritarianism and alienating intellectualism. We know that in the banking method of education, the teachers are the subjects, whereas the students are the objects of the educational process. But here, the teachers as well as the students are the subjects of the educational process. It also enables people to overcome their false perception of reality. The world becomes an object of transforming action by the people, which results in their humanization. In the banking concept, the reality and the perception of the world was actually fragmentary in nature. It is actually entirely different in the case of the problem-posing method of education. In short, the problem-posing education cannot serve the interests of the oppressor, and only a revolutionary society can carry out this education in systematic terms where the leaders must be revolutionary. That means they could stay for bringing a fundamental change which is dialogical from the outset. This feature shows the emphasis of the problem-posing method of education on dialogue. That's all about the banking concept of education written by Paulo Freire. Now, let's discuss the short questions given in your textbook. Question number 1. What is the characteristic feature of narrative education? Answer. Narrative education involves a narrating subject, that is the teacher, and listening objects, that is the students. The content in this process becomes lifeless and petrified. Reality becomes motionless, static, compartmentalized, and predictable. Empty and hollow words, verbosity, sonority of words are the other features of this mode of education. And education becomes an act of depositing in which the students are the depositories and the teacher is the depositor. Question number 2. What is referred to as the banking concept of education? Answer. It is a mode of education in which education is an act of depositing, the students are depositories, and the teacher is the depositor. The teacher is authoritative, and the scope of action allowed to the students extends only as far as receiving, filing, and storing the deposits. Lack of creativity, transformation, and knowledge is another feature of this misguided system. Question number 3. What does the banking concept of education do to minorities? Answer. The banking concept of education gives privilege to the dominant minority to prescribe rules and regulations for the less privileged majority. Question number 4. Problem-posing education doesn't serve the interest of the colonizer. Why? Answer. The fundamental character of the problem posing education is emancipation of the oppressed. It enables teachers and students to become subjects of the educational process by overcoming authoritarianism, and it results in humanization. The colonizer stands for oppression, authority, and dehumanization. Hence, the problem posing education doesn't serve the interests of the colonizer. Question number 5. What is the problem in mechanically memorizing the narrated content? Answer. Mechanical memorization of the narrated content becomes lifeless, petrified, detached from reality, and disconnected from its totality. It makes the students receive, memorize, and repeat the deposited knowledge, and they lack creativity, transformation, knowledge, inquiry, invention, etc. Question number 6. What constitutes knowledge? Answer. Knowledge is a process of inquiry, and it emerges only through invention and reinvention, through the restless, impatient, continuing, hopeful inquiry that human beings pursue in the world, and with each other. Question number 7. How does the concept of the all-knowing teacher impede production of knowledge? Answer. The all-knowing teacher projects an absolute ignorance on others and negates education and knowledge as a process of inquiry. As a result, the scope of action allowed to the students extends only as far as receiving, filing, and storing the deposits. This minimizes the students' critical faculties and creative power. Thus, the people become manageable beings, and they simply adapt to the world as it is and to the fragmented view of reality deposited in them. Thank you.